Hey, what's up? My name is JM Chaley and welcome to my channel. This week we are doing the creature spotlight for the month of March. And I'm going to talk about goblins. Wait a minute, hold on. I know, the creature spotlight is supposed to showcase a supernatural being or a beastie that is underrepresented in fantasy fiction. The whole point is for me to talk about stuff that we'd like to see more of or see something differently. So let's focus on the latter criteria of what the creature spotlight is supposed to be about. Of course, we see plenty of goblins in fantasy fiction, but from where I'm standing, they all kind of look the same. But that is not how they were depicted in folklore, 200 years ago or even during the Middle Ages. Now, granted, there's a lot of different interpretations of what a goblin was, what they looked like, and how they behaved, and what they were all about. But I want to take a look at the pre-Tolkien goblin. The idea of what a goblin was to the average person before they were sort of modernized and homogenized into this kind of generic green-skinned warrior from fantasy fiction. Now, there is some disagreement on what a goblin was, what they looked like, what they did. I mean, most sources say that goblins were short, they were homely, they weren't, handsome people at all. But there seems to be no congruent view on exactly what a goblin looked like, how tall they were, the physical descriptions, or did they look like David Bowie? Give this video a like if you get that reference. Some talk about them simply playing tricks, some talk about them kidnapping children, some talk about them killing children, some talk about them helping people and healing people. It's very inconsistent across the different stories and regions what a goblin was. So let's get into some of the types of goblins, because not everyone in a particular region called them goblins or considered goblins the same thing, as I've said, across the board. There is also a hobgoblin. A hobgoblin is kind of a goblin, but it isn't. The difference there is that goblins were depicted as usually mischievous, or at worst, malevolent beings, whereas the hobgoblin was usually maybe a trickster, but they kind of helped out more often than they caused problems. D&D has their own version of a hobgoblin, which isn't very nice, but in folklore, the hobgoblin was usually a pain in your ass, but not necessarily an adversary or an enemy. Then you have kobolds. Kobolds, some say, are simply the German word for goblin. And kobolds are usually found underground. And here is where, once you get into the kind of the Germanic and maybe even Scandinavian, here's where you see this kind of blurred line between things like goblins or kobolds, gnomes, dwarves, dark elves, all these kind of bearded short people that lived under the ground and mined for things. It kind of all blended together, and we never really got a very clear delineation on which people were which. And by the way, that doesn't just apply to Germany. It applies to other regions of Europe as well, where they kind of blended these kind of underground beings together. Which brings me to knockers. Knockers are exclusively living underground, mining for minerals. They're named after the sound that you would hear when you're walking above ground, this kind of dunk, 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 as you're walking through the woods or what have you, and you hear them mining for ore or gems or what have you underground, and that's kind of what they do. There's not a lot of stories of them coming up and causing problems, but the idea is that they're always there under your feet, working on whatever they're doing. And again, that aligns with tales of dark elves, gnomes, dwarves, all this stuff kind of blended together. It's no wonder why Tolkien turned his attention to Scandinavian and maybe Germanic folklore to build Middle-earth and populate it with these interesting beings of folklore. Redcaps are another example of a goblin. I usually see them as kind of their own thing, but redcaps are sometimes considered goblins that have red caps, usually stained with the blood of whoever they've killed. They're known to be pretty nasty, and these beings are not someone you'd want to run across. So in the case of some of the goblins I mentioned previously, where there's a kind of unknown, are they friend or foe, do they just want to be left alone in mine? No, the redcaps are out to get you, kill you, maybe eat you, and they are not your friends. And the last couple of examples of goblins, which I found surprising, are brownies and leprechauns. Now, I always think of brownies and leprechauns as more on the fae side. And of course, these examples come from the British Isles, particularly in Ireland. I never really thought of a leprechaun as a goblin before, but they do meet a lot of the criteria. They're short, they've got magic, they're not particularly handsome, although they could be. It's a little vague what they're up to, they're mischievous. We hear stories of them drinking and maybe fixing shoes. You know, there's a blurry kind of line there, right? So someone might have along the way said, yeah, they're a type of goblin. Yeah, just put them in with goblins. I mean, that kind of delineation makes it interesting because now you're taking goblins away from sort of this ogre-ish or monster kind of idea and putting them with the fae. Do they belong with the Seelie court or maybe the unseelie court if you're getting into these types of things? You know, do they align themselves, or do they know the Tuatha De Danann if you're familiar with Irish mythology? Now we're kind of like shifting a strong turn what goblins could be, in that they're with the fae rather than with the monsters or with some people that live in another region of the 9 worlds if you're thinking of the Norse mythology. So again, huge dispersion over what a goblin is all across Europe. I want to go into some stories that were published about goblins in and around the time that Tolkien wrote The Hobbit. Now, this would be late 1800s, early 1900s, these stories, and they show goblins in what I think is kind of the original cast, you know, the original mold, what goblins were or how they were seen back in the day before they were kind of brought out and made popular under the Tolkien lens. So the first story I want to recap for you is called The Benevolent Goblin. This story came out around the 13th or 14th century in England, and it talked about this goblin who had this drinking horn that was gold and encrusted with gems, and he would bring it to knights who were on the battlefield or were parched or hungry or wounded or who knows what, and he would lend them the horn, drink from this horn, and they would feel cool and refreshed, and they feel much, much better. And this goblin just wandered around helping knights, helping people out. Until one time, this devious knight tricked the goblin and said, please let me drink from your horn. And he took it, drank from it, and absconded with it. He stole it. And eventually this knight was found because he was bragging about it in a tavern, how he stole this drinking horn from a goblin. And they arrested him, and they took the drinking horn back, and you're thinking, oh, they're going to return it to the goblin, I hope. Nope, they gave it to the King of England. And lo and behold, they never saw the goblin again. He was probably like, you ungrateful motherfuckers. You know, but there's the kind of the moral of the story there. But he was a benevolent goblin. How about that? Another story is called The Goblin Pony. And this basically revolves around the idea that there was this haunted pony, or this pony that was kind of bewitched and maybe thought of being a goblin that maybe shape-shifted into a pony. It was the late 1800s, and it took place in France. This is a French story. And this grandmother warned her grandchild, or actually all her grandchildren, be careful, it's Halloween. When you go outside, there's spirits out there, there's goblins, you gotta be careful. So the grandchildren, they go out and they're playing and everything, and they come across this pony. And they're like, let's go check out the pony. Now, they've heard the warnings from their grandmother. They know the stories. They don't care. They're going to go to the pony. They go to the pony, they pet the pony, they're hanging out with the pony. The pony doesn't care. One of the kids gets on the pony, rides the pony around, pony doesn't care. Great. A couple of more kids get on the pony, ride them around, they don't care. Or rather, the pony doesn't care. Soon, all the kids are on the pony riding at once. The pony is unaffected by all the weight of the children, and they're running around having a great time. Suddenly, the pony runs for the ocean. They can't stop the pony, they can't change its trajectory, it just runs right into the ocean, and all the kids drown. Now, this story kind of goes hand in hand or holds similarities with a lot of stories of Kelpie, which is a horse-like fey creature that lurks around in lakes and stuff and lures people into the water to drown them. So there's some parallels there too. But the idea of a goblin turning into a pony, I mean, the story is called The Goblin Pony, is another very different view of what a goblin is and how they behave and what they do. And the last story I want to share with you is called Goblins Turn to Stone. This is a Dutch story that came out in the early 1900s. This story kind of starts off expounding the benefits of eating cheese. I shit you not. Cheese is good for you, gotta eat your cheese. But it also goes on to warn you that cheese, if you eat too much cheese at nighttime, it causes nightmares. Is that a thing? I don't know. I will have to ask my Dutch friends if that's a thing. But in any case, that's kind of the preamble to this story, and saying that the Dutch people believed that these nightmares were actually caused by goblins and not cheese. Keep eating your cheese. It's important. So there was this old woman in a village laying in her bed, and she was falling asleep, and she spotted a goblin at the foot of her bed about ready to give her nightmares. Now, this goblin had turned visible for whatever reason, because in this depiction, goblins could become invisible if they had their red caps on. See, we've come full circle now, right? Red caps. So these goblins have red caps, and if they have them on their head, they can be invisible. Maybe the goblin took it off for whatever reason, who knows. She saw the goblin, and she's like, "You're not going to give me nightmares," and she sprung out of bed and stabbed him in the foot with a needle and stole his red cap, and the goblin ran away. And so now she's thinking, this may be a good opportunity for me to get rid of all the goblins in the village. So she left a note in the place where the goblin kind of snuck out from, the little crevice in her wall or whatever, and basically said, "I'm going to return your cap to you, but you need to leave a gold chain in its place. I'm going to hang the red cap on a branch in the moors, and you leave a gold chain in its place, and that'll be the exchange. But you have to bring all your friends, bring all your goblin friends." And that's what happened. She invited all the men, all the warriors from her village to the moors. And when the goblin showed up to make the exchange, all the men leapt into action. And of course, these goblins were invisible, so they're kind of reaching through the air, kind of waist height, grabbing it at the air, and occasionally they'd hit pay dirt and grab a red cap and pull it off the head of a goblin, and suddenly that goblin would be visible. And they did this for all through the night as the goblins are running around, freaking out, and soon the sun started to come up. And even though they had only pulled the caps off a fraction of the goblins, none of the goblins, even the ones that were invisible, wanted to go back home and explain to their goblin ruler what had just happened. So they all elected to stay and get turned to stone when the sun came up. It's interesting here because Tolkien goblins turned to stone in the sun too. And this folklore would have been around the time that he wrote The Hobbit. And I wonder if he dipped into any kind of Dutch folklore. We know he did Scandinavian, but it's pretty interesting that the whole goblin turned to stone thing is from folklore. So that about wraps it up. Goblins, we can look at them all different kinds of ways. They've got an interesting history. They've been depicted all kinds of ways. I think if we could get in a time machine and go back to the Middle Ages or even like the 13th century, 14th century, I don't think anyone would have really agreed on what a goblin was. And today we kind of see goblins as one thing, this kind of green-skinned race, I think. If you're in the fantasy fiction genre, poking around or playing role-playing games. And I just wanted to take another look at what they used to be and what they could be again. And we have seen examples of goblins being shown in kind of the other form, maybe the original form or the alternate forms that kind of goes back to the pre-Tolkien times and what goblins were thought of back then. J.K. Rowling did it with her goblins in a way. Kevin Hearn has a hobgoblin in his Ink and Sigil series that is more fae-like than anything else. And so these examples are out there. They're just, I think, scarce. And it was worth talking about. Maybe it's something you can include in your fantasy fiction. Maybe it's something you'd like to see in a fantasy fiction you're reading. Let me know in the comments what you think about goblins and different ways that they can be portrayed, or maybe that you've seen them portrayed. If you like this video, please give it a like, and as always, please subscribe. I post every Thursday, and you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also read the first chapter of my book, A Flower in Hell, on jmchaley.com. Join my newsletter, leave me a message. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.